This video is brought to you by NordVPN. Over the last few months, Iran has been beset by problems. In September, the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman who was apparently killed by Iran's morality police for failing to cover all of her hair with her hijab, provoked protests across the country, which have continued on and off for the last few months. These protests have lasted longer than anyone expected, but in the last few weeks or so, they've apparently died down, in part because the Iranian regime have started executing protesters. Nonetheless, it's becoming abundantly clear that the vast majority of the Iranian public oppose the Ayatollah's regime. So in this video, we're going to have a look at why the protests have stalled, why we should expect more protests in the coming months, and what future protests will need in order to succeed. So let's start with what happened in the last few weeks. As the months went by and it became clear that protests weren't going away by themselves, the Iranian regime was left with essentially two options. They could either make concessions and hope to placate the protesters while maintaining their grip on power, or they could crack down and try to essentially scare the protesters into submission. In December, there were signs that the regime was going to make concessions. Iran's Attorney General seemed to imply that the morality police would be abolished when he announced that they had been, quote, shut down from where they were set up. However, in the past few weeks, it's become clear that the regime has instead decided to crack down. State media quickly U-turned on the Attorney General's comments, claiming he had been misinterpreted, and the Supreme Council of the Cultural Revolution slammed the door on relaxing rules around the hijab, claiming that hijabs preserve women's dignity and stop them being sexualized. Then in mid-December, Iranian authorities started issuing death sentences for protesters. So far, 4 men have been executed in connection with the protests, and at least 18 others have been sentenced to death. Most of these men have been charged with mahaba, a vague crime that means something like waging a war on God or corruption on earth. Some of the trials have been broadcast on state television, including the trial of Mohammad Karami, a 22-year-old national karate champion, and Sayed Mohammad Hosseini, a 39-year-old volunteer children's coach. This is presumably to intimidate the protesters. On top of that, one execution has been carried out in public. Majid Reza Ranavad, a 23-year-old arrested in November, was hanged from a crane in the city of Mashhad on December the 8th. This is particularly worrying, given that nearly 20,000 people have been arrested during the protests so far, including at least 168 children. Now, this is in some sense unsurprising. This is how the Ayatollah's regime have responded to protests in the past, and they'll want to avoid a repeat of 1979, when the Shah's attempts to placate protesters ended in revolution. Back in the present day, the regime has succeeded in temporarily stemming the protests, which have subsided since December, but we should expect more protests in the near future. The background conditions for a revolt are definitely there. The recent protests have made it clear that the majority of the Iranian public are against the Ayatollah's regime, and that this sentiment cuts across regional and class divisions. The regime were never quite as popular as they claim to be, but public support for the regime has been waning, especially fast in the past 15 years or so, because of their economic mismanagement and the growing ideological divide between the regime and the Iranian public. Economic mismanagement and Western sanctions have crippled the Iranian economy. GDP per capita is down about 70% from its 2012 peak and lower than what it was when the Ayatollahs came to power in 1979. Inflation is running at 50%, youth unemployment hovers somewhere between 20 and 30%, and the country suffers from regular water shortages, partly caused by the government's decision to redirect water from Iran's poorer western regions towards its wealthier central regions. Politically, the Iranian public has become more socially liberal, but the regime has gone in the opposite direction, becoming less democratic and as socially conservative as ever. This was made most apparent in 2009, when the regime rigged the presidential elections to prevent the more moderate candidates from winning, triggering massive protests across Iran before the authorities cracked down again. You get the idea. While the crackdown might have worked for the time being, the Iranian public are clearly fed up with the regime, so we should expect more protests soon. So when the protests restart, what will they need to do to be successful? Well, as we see it, there are basically 4 things that the protests need to be successful. Better organisation and leadership, a more explicit aim, elite disunity, and at least partial support from the security apparatus. Let's start with organisation and leadership. So far, no leader has really emerged out of the protests, and while there are online groups coordinating protest, there's no real structure. This makes large protests less likely. So far, where there have been lots of individual protests, they've been relatively impromptu, and each only involves tens of thousands of people at most. This probably won't be enough to topple the regime. In 2009, for example, an estimated 3 million people took to the streets to protest the election interference, and even this wasn't enough. A leader and an organisation means better coordination and larger protests, and also provides a viable and visible alternative to the Ayatollahs. Second is a more explicit aim. So far, the protesters haven't really demanded anything specific, and the demands that have emerged have been inconsistent. Some protesters have called for the end of the morality police, some have called for better political representation, some have called for better economic prospects, and some have called for complete revolution. Now, originally, the lack of a single explicit demand has its advantages, because, well, the regime couldn't offer a solution as they did in 2019 and 2021. The 2019 protests were triggered by a reduction in fuel subsidies, and the 2021 protests were triggered by water shortages in the province of Khuzestan. Both times, the Ayatollahs stemmed the protests by responding to the protesters' demands. In 2019, they redirected public funds towards the poor, who couldn't afford fuel, and away from the relatively wealthy who could. In 2021, they redirected water away from the Iranians in central Iran towards Iranians in Khuzestan. Obviously, they couldn't do that with the most recent bout of protests because, well, it wasn't entirely clear what the protesters wanted apart from change. While this was an advantage originally, the lack of an explicit objective makes it harder to maintain enthusiasm and momentum for the protests because there's no clear aspiration. Third is elite disunity. In the past, there have been factions within the Iranian regime. Moderates and conservatives have disagreed over economic policy, the interpretation of Islamic law, and whether to emphasize on the Islamic versus republican nature of the constitution. But in the last 10 years or so, the conservatives within the regime have consolidated their position. And while the occasional cleric or parliamentarian spoke out in support of the protests, for the most part, the regime has remained pretty united. If this were to change and a faction within the regime came out in support of the protests, this would present a viable alternative to the current regime and give the protests momentum and aspiration. Finally, at least partial support from the security services. One of the deciding factors in the 1979 revolution was the indecisiveness of the army, who generally refrained from cracking down on the protesters and ended up abandoning certain cities to the protesters. So far, the Iranian security services have remained loyal to the regime and proved willing to crack down on the protests. But if they were to lend even their tacit support to the protesters, this could undercut the state's coercive capacity and potentially pave the way to a successful revolution. So you get the idea. While the authorities have temporarily stemmed the protests, there's clearly widespread discontent with the regime, and we should expect further protests in the near future. Whether they can succeed will depend on a bunch of things, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the status quo in the country is politically unstable, and 2023 could be a make or break year for the regime. But this conflict seems far from over, and with things like this continuing into 2023, it's easy to feel like the world is an increasingly unsafe place. But when it comes to your personal life and digital safety, NordVPN has your back. It's an unfortunate reality that online scams and phishing attacks are on the rise right now. With us getting bombarded by emails from our banks, social media accounts, and even annoying newsletters we forgot we even signed up to, it's easy to click the wrong thing. One weak link can compromise security and bring things crashing down. With the protection of NordVPN, though, you can use their threat protection features to identify potentially suspicious links. Even if you did reach a suspicious website, NordVPN's data encryption tools would protect against a number of other attacks like malicious man-in-the-middle breaches. Even if things do go wrong, NordVPN's dark web monitoring is always scanning for your details and passwords, and can actively notify you before you even notice. It's easy to think that it won't happen to you, or that you won't be fooled, but these scams are pretty subtle, and when we see even massive firms falling for it, it's worth protecting yourself as much as you can. So click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR to get a huge discount on their 2-year plan, and with their 30-day money-back guarantee, you've got nothing to lose. Thanks for your support, and make sure to click the link in the description.